power of the life of Jesus is much greater if we really put ourselves into it as if we were living it and realize that the people who lived it were people not dissimilar to us. Despite whatever they do in the movies to make the dress look different or the people behave differently, human consciousness is essentially the same. And the desire to escape suffering and to find happiness is universal. And the response of the human heart when the light comes is always the same. Time, place, distance, culture, language, nothing changes that. It's always the same. Our nature is based on realities that so far transcend the material. The material is just the final expression of it. So you had, at the time that this story takes place, Jesus was an avatar to the Jewish people. So the entire drama took place in the culture of Judaism, and the culture of Judaism as distinct from the power that was over them, the Romans and the others. They were still a distinct minority who were allowed to have their own life, but they couldn't influence beyond a certain boundary. And there was great frustration among those people on many different levels. They were frustrated, those who looked to worldly power, they were frustrated because of the limits of their power. Those who were sincere spiritually were frustrated because their high teaching had been hijacked by a corrupt priesthood. And the inner reality of their true religion, the truth of Judaism, was now in the hands of a materialistic culture. The temple itself in Jerusalem, which was so touted as such an enormous accomplishment for the Jewish people that even to this day, everyone looks back on it as this great, to be someday returned time of glory. It's ironic if you think of it from a completely other point of view, because the greater the worldly power is not necessarily the greater the spiritual truth. We tend to see those two things as the same, but we're shifting that reality again. And those of you who have ever been to the Vatican, especially if you go first, for example, to Assisi, as often some of us have done, where you go to where St. Francis lived, and you go and you see the little portiuncula, which was the first chapel that Francis felt from God he was to rebuild. And it was around this tiny little chapel that the beginning of his great work began. It's a very, very humble building, and it now sits in the middle of an enormous cathedral. You literally walk into this very beautiful, but very big, high, large, solid cathedral, and then you go into the little portiuncula, this little tiny little chapel in the middle. The little chapel was Francis. The portiuncula was what organized worldly power decided was the best way to express it. And you go to the Vatican and you see St. Peter's Square and the enormous edifice which is that building and the huge statues up at the top. And I mean, they need a square that large because when the Pope comes out and speaks, then tens of thousands of people come, and it works for all of them. And you walk inside, and I mean, it's so physical, it's so big, you can't help but feel there must be something really powerful going on here. But is it powerful of God, or is it just powerful? And the situation in Israel at the time that Jesus incarnated was really exactly similar. There was this huge edifice with people with an enormous amount of power who had claimed the right to define what Judaism was at that time. And they exercised that power not necessarily for the good of the people, although that was the veneer under which they operated, but it feathered their own nests very well. Archaeologically, they've discovered this extremely wealthy neighborhood and evidence of beautiful wealthy homes and wealthy goods, which is associated right near the temple, and it was where all the priests lived. And then you have, in contrast to this, those true lovers of God who understood that worldly power and spiritual power are by no means the same thing. Merely to make a big noise and a big impression and a big edifice in the material world does not necessarily indicate purity of heart. It doesn't necessarily indicate freedom from ego. In fact, it's often very difficult, once that kind of power is in place, to hold even a little bit of the ideals that you start with, such as the hypnosis and the power of Maya itself. So Jesus comes into this, and Jesus is called. He's called by his disciples. He's called by the needs of the time. He's called by the truth of Judaism. He's there to renew it, to bring it back. That's why there's so much emphasis in the life of Jesus of referencing back to all the prophets and to the stories of the Old Testament and to King David, because he was there to say, this is a true and a great religion, and this is what it means. But, and when he flashed through that world, imagine what an experience it was for those who had the sensitivity to recognize it. To those who truly loved God and were trying to find him in the midst of all of this pomp and ritual and rules and enormous materialism. We're trying to find that little tiny flame of divinity which had nothing to do with any of that. And here Jesus appears. And he carries within himself. He is the pure window for this pure consciousness of God, the power of which makes the stone edifices, it mocks them. You know, that temple has long since been knocked to the ground, and one bare wall remains. And people cling to that as the symbol of their people and all that it has gone through. It symbolizes so much more that I don't want to in any way make light of that part of it. But all I want to say is all of that is gone. That wealthy neighborhood where all the priests lived, it's all gone. All of the gold, all of the power, all of it, it's all gone. But that light and power that Jesus brought is as alive today as it was at the time that he walked. So he walks through this town, this country, this place where all these souls have been longing for something more profound, and there it is. And they have to have a lot of courage to take that, because on the other side you have this well-established, this is how it's done, this is how it means, this is how God is pleased. And on the other hand, you have this one wandering sadhu, really literally. He owns nothing, he has no position, he has no power. And in fact, the people who are in power increasingly begin to rail against him. But people respond from their hearts. They feel and they know. And it doesn't make any difference whether people approve or disapprove. They feel it, they know. And so this huge conflagration is building, because gradually the sheer magnetism of Jesus' presence begins to draw more and more people to him. But every time he comes into that city of Jerusalem, every time he comes into there, that's where the powerful priesthood and the powerful temple are. And then he posits against it his direct revelation and his direct declaration. Where is the kingdom of heaven? It's within. And he mocks them for their rules. And they try to pin him with his philosophical or his theological misunderstandings, and he always stands up against them. And meanwhile, his followers watch. And they're watching. And you think they're certainly not always confident what's going to happen, who's going to win, how is this going to take place. And always Jesus is talking about this potential of realization, this potential of power, this potential for the kingdom. And everybody hears that in different ways. Some of them translate it into the worldly power that they themselves are seeking. Or they may not even want it, but they can't imagine how this mission could express itself unless it takes some form like they're used to seeing. And there's and Jesus, it's like he's like a wave. He keeps coming back into Jerusalem, and he has these confrontations, and everything gets very exaggerated and intense. And then he pulls away, and he goes off to the Sea of Galilee, to Capernaum, and he gathers around his disciples, and he teaches them, and he strengthens them. He takes them away from that worldly influence, and he gives them deeper and deeper experiences so that they can become more and more convinced of what they have in him and understand on a deeper and deeper level what it means to them. And then finally, Jesus knows his own destiny. He realizes that for the sake of the teaching that he's come to bring, there is going to be this final conflict. And his disciples feel it building. And Palm Sunday is the day when it begins. And as we sang at the beginning, who dreamed of the tragedy? Who knew? Because Palm Sunday is the day when it looks like it's finally all going to come together. Jesus finally decides, I will go to Jerusalem. And as David was reading from the Bible, everybody's asking, will he just take his disciples back to the Sea of Galilee, and will they just have their own little life there? Or will he walk into the center of our faith and celebrate the great festival in the temple as you are supposed to do? And is he not? Will he not? And then when he finally decides to come, and for his own reasons, for the sake of the story, he lets his power be seen. Because when much of the time Jesus held it in and only allowed that power to be seen by those who had the eyes to see. But on this Sunday, he brings himself and all his disciples in with full glory. And he tells his disciples, I will ride in on the back of a donkey, and you will process with me, and we will sing. This is not accidental as it happens. He lets the glory show. And when the priests say, this is improper, it's not right that you should be honoring him in this way, Jesus' answer is, if I silenced my disciples, the very stones would cry out. Which is to say, I am what they proclaim me to be, and all of creation will affirm it. Now, naturally, all of those who've been following him can't help but think, this is the moment. Finally, not only will the Jewish people have their day and throw off the yoke of oppression of the political yoke that's been on them. That's how people think about these things. Power means power that shows. But also, the disciples feel, finally, we will be vindicated. The temple will become ours. All of those corrupt priests will be thrown out, and we'll have this. But of course, the story doesn't go anything like that. And that's what makes this day so dramatic and poignant, and so much like life. Now I'm going to go right to last week. Most of you know that I've spent a lot of the last month in another colony in Portland with friends. A friend of mine has pancreatic cancer and is taking her last breaths. She still hasn't taken her last breath, but she's close to it. It's been about a month of hospice vigil. It was an experience that I never expected to have. It sort of came out of wherever it came. God sent it. And many of you shared in it because I was writing every day. We were doing what hospice recommends, which is instead of having a person who's dying at home be off in a back bedroom somewhere isolated, bring the person right into the center of your living room and let life go on around. So for 4 weeks, Tushti, our friend, has been lying in a hospital bed in the living room, and it's not that big a room. So the hospital bed is here, and all the nice windows, and then there's the big dining table. So the 5 of us living in the house, the dining table was sort of our world, and Tushti was just a few feet away from us. And she had not wanted to die. She's exactly the same age as I am, and she had many plans. And the cancer came on very quickly last summer. It was very advanced before she knew she had it. She made 6 months, 7 months of very determined effort to get better, but it wasn't in the cards for that to happen. And then there we are with her husband, friends, myself, and others, just watching God do what He wanted to do for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. And we're sitting at the table, and I'm just looking at all this. I'm looking at her husband, Surendra, who's being princely. And I said, if your faith in God is based on getting what you want when you pray, your faith isn't going to last very long, is it? How often do we get what we want when we pray? I mean, sometimes. And some people are very, very pleased with the fact that when they pray, they get what they want, whatever it might be. You know, I attracted my spouse, I attracted my job, I attracted my perfect child, my house, my home, my job, whatever it might be. And as Master said, sometimes prayer and karma intersect. And you actually do pray, and you actually do get what you want, because it is your karma to have it. But what is our actual relationship with God? That's the question. Is He like Amazon.com? It sounds humorous, but really, a lot of times that's what we're doing, even no matter how subtle it is. This is what I really want. And it seems harmless enough, doesn't it? You know? Tushti desired to live because she wanted to come back to Laurelwood, and she had wonderful plans of all the things that she could do. She was extremely well trained. She was at the peak of her capabilities. And everything would say, wouldn't this be what you would want? And such a prayer is not selfish. It's not a prayer that says, I want to be more important, I want to have more money. It says, I want to serve. But we add that little bit. This is how I'm going to do it, Lord. And in itself, it's not a bad thing to do. It's not a bad thing for the disciples of Jesus to have wanted to move into the center of Judaism and then allow that beautiful teaching to become Judaism at that time. Who would call that a bad intention? It's not wrong for a people to wish to be free of political oppression, to see profligate hedonists, having power over you. Why would you want that? Why would you want people to suffer? But there's a different drama that's always going on here. And don't for a minute think that it's easy to embrace that drama. It's easy to want to embrace it. It's easy to understand that this is what I ought to do. But my, how very convoluted all those threads of karma are, aren't they? And the experience that I've had in this last month, I was just thinking how appropriate that it's run into Easter. I never imagined it would run into Easter. We thought Tushti's body couldn't last 10 days, what to speak of 30 days. But it has. All it's told me, or what it's told me, in the most profound sense is, we have no idea. We really have no idea. A master knows. And many, many times in this last month, I have longed for divine vision. for omnipresence, just to be able to be literally in someone else's consciousness and understand, where is this coming from? Where is this going? But it's not given. It's not given to me even in my own life, even in the day-to-day runnings of my own life. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? Why do these things happen to me? Why not those things? And prayer becomes very much different. No? All that we're ever actually praying for is to be in harmony with God's will. And really, it's very hard to know what God's will is, because God's will is just playing itself out around us. How can you know sometimes what God's will is? Well, partly you can tell by what's happening, what's occurring around you. And how do we find, and this is exactly what the disciples of Jesus were faced with, how do we balance all these different factors? At the end of the life of Jesus, it was the time, just before, this cycle, was when he started saying, "Eat my body and drink my blood." Now it's all been organized by the Christian denominations, and they pass out wafers, and they pass out bread, and they pass out wine, and they pass out grapefruit. This is the blood, this is the body, eat the body, drink the blood, and it's all sort of worked out. But when Jesus was there, he was just with them, just in the most tangible way, with them. And suddenly he starts talking to them about eating his body and drinking his blood. And it was not clear at all what he meant. And in the Bible it says, the disciples said to one another, "This is a very hard teaching." And many of them left Jesus at that point. And Jesus did that because he knew what was coming. He knew that many of his disciples were there because it worked for them to be there. It was a little bit daring, perhaps. Maybe they were a little bit outside of the mainstream of the group, but there were wonderful people with Jesus, and they had such a wonderful time together, and he was so full of joy and laughter and wisdom, and they could go up to Jerusalem with him, and he would have these confrontations with the priests there, and he would be so triumphant, and then they would all walk back together, and they would sing, and they would have such a great time. It all worked for them. Their prayers and their lives were intersecting very nicely, right? But Jesus knew what was coming. Jesus knew that if your faith in God is based on the fact that God answers your prayers in the way you want, then your faith is not going to be very strong. And Jesus knew that the time would come when his followers would have to be so deeply rooted within themselves in what was true that they could withstand the horror, literally, that was coming to them. And even Peter, as is told in the Bible, who was one of the most stalwart and steadfast, when Jesus was arrested and taken before the authorities and his life was threatened and he was humiliated and tortured, even Peter panicked. 3 times Peter panicked and didn't have the strength within him to say, "I'm one of his followers. Do with me as you have done to him." He said, "No, I've never met him." 3 times. He recovered. But 3 times he panicked. If your faith in God is based on God answering your prayers in the way you want, sooner or later you won't have any faith in God. So Jesus knew he needed to have standing after he was gone those whose faith nothing could touch. So it wasn't that the others were bad, it was just they had gone as far as they could go. And so they go into Jerusalem, and everybody's riding the wave of Jesus' power. Who dreamed of the tragedy? How few heard in all of that chaos and noise the note that was really going to happen. Not of defeat, but God was going to answer their prayers in a way that they never imagined. And few would have had the courage to pray for. And this is the story of Jesus. This is the story especially of today, but also of Good Friday, where we're coming, and of Easter morning. when it all resolves ultimately in bliss, in the divine way. Because it never resolves in this world. It's never meant to. That doesn't mean we're supposed to be miserable in this world. It means only that our joy really comes from somewhere else. And we can bring it to this world quite nicely. At the end of Swami Kriyananda's life, he would say, many times, sometimes I feel so blissful, he said, and then he would start to weep. I just don't know what to do with myself. That's how he put it. And at the very end, he said, I used to have a certain aversion to this world, is how he would say. He said, but wherever God is present, how can there be anything less than bliss? And where is God not present? But this is the real challenge of our spiritual life. And Easter is a very good time in which to face that challenge as squarely and as powerfully as we are able. Why? Why do I love God? Why do I have faith in God? Why am I a disciple? What does it mean to be a disciple? What could take that discipleship away from me? What is the basis of it? These are questions that sooner or later we have to ask ourselves. Sitting around that table with this beautiful woman reduced to just a skeleton and everything that we would call her just becoming smaller and smaller, but this spark of divine light just still in her eyes and loving God. We have that song, when I die, look into my eyes. They will mutely say, I will be thine always. Devotees may come, devotees may go, but I will be thine always. I may go far, farther than the stars, meaning I may wander in confusion for a long time, but I will be thine. And when I die, look into my eyes, and they will mutely say, I will be thine always. That's who we are. How strong are we in that? How far can God push us? And when we break, which way will we break? Jesus' disciples got to practice in a way that 2,000 years ago we still talk about. We get to practice this morning and this afternoon and tomorrow. And the promise is there. We've experienced it. Hold on to that. Don't let anything take that away from you. Because in the end, you see, everything's taken away from you. Spend a month with someone who's dying, and dying slowly. Not sort of quickly and neatly, but very slowly. And watch everything, absolutely everything, piece by piece, be taken away from you. It's very sobering, as you can well imagine, but not unjoyful. Simultaneously, absurdly, ridiculously joyful, without any causelessly joyful. Because when everything else is taken away from us, the only thing left is what we are. Children of God, children of bliss. Bless you.